Well, welcome everybody to the last of our three-part session with Rabbi Micah Becker-Klein, Jews and Food. We covered coffee, the most important food group, of course,
Hmm.
followed by wine, important, but I would say not quite as exciting or important as bread, and specifically challah, and the nurturing nature of that incredible substance that not only highlights, you know, the gifts that God gives us through the earth, but our ingenuity to turn wheat and other grains into bread. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for your support of this program. Thank you, Micah, for being our teacher. This is the first of, we hope, many times Micah will join us for a number of different programs. And I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to be here and to do this series. We certainly can go deeper and wider on any of these topics, um, and I'm looking forward to non liquid conversation today. So we're going to challah in particular, and so what I would like to do is really go through kind of a history of how we, from biblical times until today, have related to a special bread, a special way of eating that highlights ritual times, that highlights Shabbat and holidays, um, and and evolved to that point. So it's not one of those always parts of our life. For example, so much of what we associate with as um, contemporary Jewish life, for even saying the brachot over candles, over the kiddush, over challah, so much of that is rabbinic, meaning in biblical times, we don't have these uh, descriptions of actions. People were, as we said, drinking wine or using libations. We don't have a blessing to accompany it. Similarly, with challah and any type of bread, any lechem, um, we don't really have a description of a blessing. We know people were eating. We know they were baking. So let's just start. I'm going to start here by doing a little bit of a screen share. I'm hopefully going to um, go from the live feed to back into the um, back onto a live face so we can see each other face to face. And I've got some information that I want to share with you, but it's no, it's a little boring to look at my notes. So, yeah, even if I did make them look all pretty in this spreadsheet. So let's see if I can call it up here real fast. There we go. And then we'll do the screen share. There we go. Okay.
I just want to say that looks so good. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. What you're looking at here is let's see. Oh, what you're looking at here is a chalot that I made, or that my wife and I together made. Um, for many people, I would say, starting in the 20th century, in the 1970s, with the advent of such publications as the Jewish Catalog, many people started baking challah at home in many ways. When we moved from New Jersey to New Hampshire many years ago, we found it very difficult to find fresh challah. And so my wife and I started making challah each week. My wife has kept it up pretty much. I share in it, but it's really, in a way, her passion. And so each week we have fresh challah. Um, I'll explain a little bit about that process as we get through, but you're looking at a couple of the chalot that we prepared. So, as I mentioned, in the Torah, there's really no hamotzi and there's no challah. What we can find in the Torah are references to the way in which challah, in particular, would be treated by the Jewish people. So lechem, for example, very common word in the Torah, that's bread. An Aramaic word that we should all be familiar with, common from the about the first century on, would be pita. And one of the abbreviated versions of a blessing after a meal that you can offer, as found in the Talmud, in Aramaic, says, Brich Rachamana, Malka de Alma, Mare de Hai Pita, which is Brich Rachamana, blessings, Baruch, Rachamana, like Rachamim, the blessings to the compassionate one, Malka, like Melech, de Alma, Olam, of the world, so Melech HaOlam, Ma'are de Hai Pita, who has brought forth for us Pita. So these words pita and lechem have been with us for a long time. Challah is really not used for a long time as a reference to a type of bread, but we'll get there. Most of us are familiar with the idea of manna. Now, the manna is going to, according to tradition, what happens is we have a description in the Torah, and then we'll have commentaries. The manna would fall each night. And as the manna would fall each night, by the dawn, there would be a layer on top of that as well that would kind of give it protection. The people would go out each morning to collect up the manna for their daily ration. There's a variety of descriptions of how that might be prepared, by the way. On the sixth day, and I write Friday/sixth day because I have no assumption that the way we reference Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday would be the same way that the ancient world did. So let's just say the sixth day of the week, the day right before Shabbat evening, you would pick up a double portion. And that was in order to keep you fulfilled through the end of Shabbat, the end of the Saturday evening. So some aspects of that we're going to see as we get later into what we'll call the practice of Jewish life of consuming and using challah. The second area that appears in the Torah is on a series of functional items called the showbread. I have no idea why in the King James Bible it's written as Shewbread. You may have seen that before. The translation comes from the Hebrew that you can see in the white, lechem hapanim, which really literally says lechem, bread, hapanim, like of faces, facing each other. And the understanding was that calling it a presence, like lechem panim, it was almost like God's presence, like God's face was there as part of this process. I'm going to show you I'll show you some more on the sources in a minute on my next slide. In Exodus, we get a description of it in a very short sentence, and then in Leviticus, we get a description of where it would have been put on display. This bread was not regular bread, the showbread. The lechem hapanim was part of the formal array of the altar, the Holy of Holies, where all the action would have been taking place in the time of the people, first in the wilderness, and then when we have a temple in Jerusalem, it would have been part of that arrangement. So there were 12 of these cakes. They were, we are 99% sure they would have been unleavened flour, the rules of which go into the types of foods that were permitted into the inner sanctum. And while the description doesn't say specifically it was unleavened, matzah, because all other types of product brought into the Holy of Holies in that area would have been unleavened, the assumption, the scholars agree, it would have been 12 cakes of unleavened flour. It doesn't mean matzah cracker. It just means not with yeast added. They would have been placed on the shulchan. Now, this is the word for table, but it's like ha-shulchan, like the table. There was one table that was set out in the northern section of what would have been a square between the menorah that was on display in front of the tent, 7-branch menorah, and the incense altar that would have been off to the side. This table, this shulchan, is depicted in the Arch of Titus in the section of the sacking of Jerusalem. You both see, if you've seen this piece, you'll see what stands out to most people is the 7-branch menorah that's about 6 feet tall that's being carried out, demonstrating in a way that this menorah really was in front of the temple. But if you look closer, you'll see the table that's being taken away. It's hard to see whether it was embellished, what was designed for. Suffice to say, it was important enough to make off with. Okay, so here are the two sources, and you can see that it's in Exodus. It's very, very short. Why it's the presence bread? You shall set, the quote is, you shall set a table showbread upon the table that you're going to make upon the shulchan, showbread before me. And so the interpretation is, well, this bread, if it's not for eating, and then we have the number 12, and it's there in the holy places, what is it there to help connect to us? And so the answer is it's connected to the presence of God in the world. In Leviticus is where we see the description of what this actually was. You see, it's a little hard sometimes to put together. It's not like the Torah goes, section, showbread, here's what it was, here's what it tasted like, here's what it looked like, here's where you put it, here's where we used it. There's some interesting parts I find here. So first it's fine flour, which means it's not, you're going to use, as I usually talk about, like the olive oil used to burn in the menorah that symbolizes God's presence is going to be the finest, highest quality, therefore most expensive, let's say, olive oil you can get, because it's representing God, your love for God. And the same thing now with this flour, the highest quality, the finest sifted, the most precious flour is what you're going to use into 12 cakes. And obviously the tribal references, the lunar references, we can find so many ways why this 12 works for us. And you can see set out 6 by 6 in a way. Remember the high priest has on there the ephod, and it's got the 6 and 6 also on it there. And it's just going to create these mirrors for us. And what I find fascinating next is the flavoring that must have come in, because now they're putting frankincense in front of it. So the bread is itself a truma, itself a sacrifice, an offering unto God, but it's not consumed by the fire. In other words, this bread, when you got the fire around it, the bread gets left. And we learn that each week after the Friday, the new bread is brought out, those loaves, the 12 loaves that were there, are then broken up and distributed amongst the priests, starting with the high priest and then the others around it. Okay. Now, so that's, and before I move on, do we have any questions? I can try and see if I can open it up. If you've got a question, you can send up a hand, probably easiest for me to see, or observations. Okay, yes, Kirk. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, it's a little bit humorous, Rabbi, and thank you for great presentations. I've been listening. But I have a question. Is your recipe for challah somewhere posted where we can do what you and your wife do?
Oh, very good question. I will happily share it with you. So here's the quick answer. The um, the recipe that we use is an adaptation. Whoops, I went to the next page. Sorry about that. Nope. Let me stop that. Okay. So the recipe that we use, I love this, um, and I will send it to you. You go to recipe number 2 in the Jewish catalog, published in 1975 by the Strassfelds, and oh gosh, the third person is Steve. I can't think of his last name. And so there's 2 recipes. You can go to a second recipe, and then you have to start fiddling with it. And so you start replacing the white flour with just enough wheat flour that you don't change the structure of the flavor, but it gives you a little heft to it. And well, we don't use margarine because then they were using margarine. So we replaced the margarine with coconut oil. If you like coconut oil, we like coconut oil. Adds a little sweetness to it for sure. Um, and I will happily share it with you. And I will say, everywhere we've baked, it's always different. I, I'm much more of a cook than a baker because cooking, you can, it's an art. They say baking is a science. So I love that our challah is a little different each week because we're a little more of the artists than the scientists when we go at the challah. But the most important thing to realize is it's a time consuming process. It's like a double process. So you make the dough, it sits, does its rising stuff, then you braid it, then it sits, then you bake it. It's not a one step, so it gets a little bit. You have to set your timer, go do your work, come back type thing. One can certainly speed it up. This is just our recipe. You can find so many lovely recipes in the world, by the way. Um, and we'll get to them because I've got some examples for you of where we're headed. Because interestingly enough, what we think of as a sweetbread challah, the braided egg, is a very much from about the 1800s on, and also a European approach. So, okay. Other questions? Okay. So now, how do we get from bread to challah? And the major shift is going to be what happens when we go from being a people in the land, and we're the people in Israel, and there's a temple, and there's temple based worship, to the expulsion. And we're talking both first and second. So, meaning 586 BCE, we wind up in Babylon, we come back to the land of Israel. Then in the year 70, the Roman expulsion brings us to many lands around the Roman Empire at that time. As far as we can trace it, the entry of the brachot and the challah evolves in its fullness really in that second time, right? Really in the early years from 70 on, when we have a book called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is our first collection of writings post-biblical. So if the biblical writings, if the Hebrew Bible ends in the year 0, for lack of a better argument, then the Mishnah is going to be a collection of teachings, not narrative, but a collection of teachings that says, light 2 candles, this is what we do, that go from the year 0 approximately until about the year 200. Really, the year 70 until about the year 200. And in many scholars' estimations, trying to write down as quickly as possible all of the information that we were feared we were going to lose that was already happening at that time. Not that they were necessarily making new things happen, but reflecting on what was going on. Let's leave the conversation about early rabbinics for another conversation. It'll be a great one to have anyhow. And so in that very change, we go from being a religion that's centered in one place in one time towards Jerusalem with temple-based worship to everywhere we live is holy, to every home is a sanctuary, a temple, every person is a priest, the most obvious shift of that is Passover. That we believe maybe one of the first things that happens in expulsion times is the creation of home-based Passover. In biblical times, Passover would have been a temple-based pilgrimage, and then an event that happened pretty much in Jerusalem, not an event that happened in your home. It was brilliant, amazing to say, listen, everybody, your home is now the temple, your table is now the altar. What happens there is as holy as anywhere else. We're going to see this again and again. Shabbat and Shabbat table and the event of the Friday evening in a person's home also is going to be a little bit of that entry into holiness of the individual. So now that brings us to challah. So now going from what might have been on display, the 12 loaves that were out and about, how do we bring this into people's homes? Oops, where did it go? There we go. Oh no, I went to the wrong page. Hold on one second. Let me go. Let me read this. So what happens, and I can do this while I'm talking to you, is that the shift becomes you can do this in your home. Now, challah as itself, the idea of challah is that challah originally is a term that references the portion of dough that would have been taken off of any time you prepared wheat, balled up at least the size of an olive and burned in an oven, as reflecting on like this ancient sacrificial practice that sacrifices were offered in not only in the animal forms that we talk a lot about, but so much wheat, barley, flour, and dough offerings, for example, were brought. Challah literally means a portion. Now, here's an important bit of information. If you've ever looked at a box of kosher matzah, now these days I have to say that because it didn't used to be a thing, but now you can get matzah year round. But go look at a kosher for Passover box of matzah. Let's just say that we're going to go with Streets or Manischewitz, I don't care who you use. And you turn it around and you look on the side of the box and it goes kosher for Passover, OU, and then it says the following phrase, challah is taken. And the first time I saw that, and I was like, wait, what? This is how I got deep down this rabbit hole. I was like, what do you mean challah is taken? Challah, it can't be challah, it's matzah. It can't be what we think of as challah, because challah is braided bread and it rises. And so you realize, well, actually, challah means the portion was taken. That process of taking a piece of dough out of the larger portion, you're making a whole amount of dough. You take off just a little bit. This process allows the bread to be kosher. It would allow whatever that product is. It doesn't have to be what we're calling challah for Shabbat. It can be bagels. It can be your sandwich bread. It can be whatever you're eating. It allows us to say hamotzi, and it allows us not only to have it as a sanctified bread at the moments where we need or want to say that, but allows us to recognize this kind of interplay, as Marcia so wonderfully said, like bread, this idea is like between the gift of the divine gift of wheat and yeast and all that, mix it together with human ingenuity and the divine gift of that, and we have bread. Otherwise, we just have wheat in a field and we're gnawing on it like the cows and the sheep. So thank God for that. So that's why I like the challah part where you pull it off and say, and you should note that whenever you see bread in a supermarket or otherwise that says kosher, it means that along the way, in the bakery, in the factory, there was a process where someone took off a bit of the dough, said the blessing, and threw it into an oven or burned it in some way. All right. So the first time that we see people talking about that process is in the Mishnah, which was, okay, so because the Torah just says, look, there's bread and it's the priests are going to make it and it's the finest flour and it sits in Jerusalem. But that didn't tell us how Anne or James or Kirk or Susan is going to have breakfast. Like how are we going to eat today? So that's a little bit about the Mishnah. Like it's sometimes a little less sexy, but here, so it gives us permitted flowers, meaning what are the flowers that are in this line? Because not all flour would be leaven. For example, you can use rice flour. Rice flour is edible, it's kosher. It just doesn't fit the category of this type of food, of this type of sacrifice. We can recognize it very well. It's not glutinous. So they walk through the list there of permitted flours, and then it gets into how to separate. And now it gets very technical. It's not the most important part of our discussion, but what's interesting for me was seeing the distinction between the way that the baker, meaning the person communally doing this for lots of people, would do it versus conversations of the individual. And it had to do with, like, if you had bunches together and you had one loaf and you smashed another loaf into it, did you have to take another piece off of the original? It gets very technical. But the difference between you and your home and you think you're making, let's say, 2 and then it becomes 1 is a different technical conversation than the baker who thinks they're making 200 and all of a sudden they're making 210 or 175, and do you have to distinguish? The third conversation in this teaching is very interesting. See, pre-modern homes didn't have an oven. In fact, my grandparents who came from Poland would say that there was a town oven. My grandmother remembers there's a town oven. Like you went to the baker had the oven, and everyone else is kind of, I don't know how it worked. I don't know how they paid for it or not. You put your food, you baked your stuff in that oven. And so imagine that you've got a communal oven. Now, somebody says, you took my challah. No, you took my challah. How do you know who your challah is? So the Mishnah goes through how do people mark their challahs, what's okay to market, not market. And then finally in the Mishnah, it gets through this larger conversation. It's like what used to happen, where people would bring the bread to the priest and offer the dough to the priest, offer bread to the priest. This is one of the ways that they would eat and live. They didn't have land, they didn't have food, and they didn't have money. So by people bringing food, it literally helped sustain the priesthood. So it doesn't tell us egg, right? It doesn't tell us sweet. It doesn't tell us braided. It doesn't tell us anything. If I said, you tell me what challah is today, to anybody on the street, so far we haven't heard it, unless you really knew about the pinching and pulling and throwing in the fire. Okay. So it then takes, okay. As I said, the biggest shift is to go from just a pinch portion to what we're going to call bread, the staff of life. As we know, some of you might know this quote from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8. Humans do not live on bread alone, but from the word of God do we derive all good things in life. So, as I mentioned, the tearing off of the dough is a reminder of our former practice. I can't emphasize this enough. I've taught a lot of children through the B'nai Mitzvah process, and inevitably they wind up somewhere in the book of Leviticus with their bar bat mitzvah portion, and they have to talk about sacrifices. And we always say, well, we don't do sacrifice anymore. Well, we haven't done sacrifice anymore. We don't do it anymore. We stopped doing it. We don't do that. All we do is pray. We pray with our hearts, and I believe it. But then I realized, we actually do sacrifice. The bread, the challah that is taken, is as ancient of a practice as our ancestors. And other than killing the yeast, I'm sorry for the yeast, it doesn't injure any animals or take any life. And how wonderful is it to say, there are ways in which we say it's not just for me. I'm going to take some of this and give it back, whatever that means symbolically. You might say, wait, I need that last piece of bread. But no. I mean, imagine the times before, pre-modern times, where you just had enough, barely. Living in Eastern Europe, living in Morocco, living in Persia or Iraq, wherever our people were, Tunisia, and we barely had enough each week. And what we did each week was took a little bit of that dough and said, here, God, for you, I have enough. I mean, that to me is a really deep, mindful practice that I love. And I'd say people, no, actually, there still are some sacrifices, just not animals, thank God. So, like some of those other changes I mentioned, like Passover, challah in your home as part of the Shabbat ritual made every home a temple and every person a priest. Salt also mentioned in the Mishnah, in that teaching there, like what you could add and what you couldn't add to render this okay. It was like you can't, like the salt was important to have because salt, every sacrifice brought to the temple was salted. We can talk about health issues and all that otherwise. However, we also know that in the pre-modern diet, I mean pre-20th century diet, that salt was actually a very essential element, nutrient, and for many people still, you could argue, say it still is very important. It provides minerals that we need in balance. And so recognizing a little bit like, okay, we don't live on bread alone. We need some other things to sustain us is worked right into this teaching. All right, so we've got connection to the sacrifices now twice with our bread, both in the tearing and the challah blessing. When you make the dough, you actually say the blessing, lahafris challah, to free, to literally to tear out a piece of pork, lahafris, like parsha, like the portion, to portion out challah, a portion. Yes, Anne. I see a hand up, Anne.
Your mention of salt, I'm wondering if this is the origin of the gift of bread and salt as a gift to a welcome gift or a home gift. We moved into a new
Yeah.
house recently, and our next door neighbor brought us a fresh baked loaf of bread and a little package of salt to welcome us.
Oh, yes, yes. And often tied into that quote from Deuteronomy, a person doesn't live on bread alone. And so you don't just give a person, it's kind of, all of this works together, right? Like because nobody's going to, I guess you give you peanut butter and bread, but nobody, thankfully it's salt. It's useful. And look what it does to our tables. Look what this does to like I really like the idea of mindful eating, and I think Shabbat and Shabbat dinner is a mindful eating experience. So the blessing of candles, the blessing of kiddush, of the wine or juice, the blessing of challah, to sit and eat. It's just like, okay, look, we were conduits of something very holy, and it elevates the table. So yeah, thank you. I think this idea is really important. Not too much salt, of course. Okay, so now we get deep. Now we're gonna get deep into history. So when is the first reference to challah? And 1488 is the first time that we're going to see something in writing that says there's a bread that we eat, and you can see it's in this book called Leket Yosher. And it's the first time that it's the first time we have in writing, eat challah. I don't have the exact quote, but as opposed to take challah, right? So technically, right, the reason why it says it on the matzah is it's taken. But all of a sudden in 1488, we have the first publication of a book that says, here, we're going to eat a bread, and it's called challah. How it got from Austria to Poland, I have no idea, but it takes off. And as you might know, Poland had pre-Holocaust probably the largest Jewish population in Eastern Europe, from there through the Pale of Settlement. And so when foods took off and ways of engaging took off, I think it really kind of ran through the neighborhood, as it were. And if you had one oven and everybody was baking together, I think quickly people started seeing things change. See, originally, and we'll get to some of these other ethnicities, originally challah was round. Remember, go back to those 12 loaves, the lechem hapanim. They're round. They're like pita. If you bake a bread, let's say if I'm going to make you can make like a French bread in in a Dutch oven type pot. Those are round breads. Unless you've got a loaf pan, I think the idea of making a shaped bread that would be anything other than round in pre-modern society, because I think your client, who knows how much cold, how much warmth, how much rise, how much width you were going to get. Was it going to spread when you put it down? And so I think round gave you the easiest way to create that bread. The reason why breads like naan or pita, quick handmade breads, tend to be round is because that's the easiest way to produce it kind of in a uniform way. Matzah, by the way, that comes out of a box is made on a machine. Matzah, if you think about it, if you've seen handmade matzah, or what we call shmura matzah, the matzah that you can get that's handmade in, let's say, the Lower East Side or somewhere in Los Angeles or Jerusalem, they're almost always roundish. Okay, so then not only do we have the first reference to challah at this point, we start getting the first references to some different recipes. Until this point, we do not have any evidence that challah was sweet or egg or anything other than what we would have described as a plain bread, like pita or something or matzah or something like that. It was a very basic food. When we get to this point, 1480s into the 1500s, now into Poland, we'll start seeing some publications that mention potato challah, egg wash on top, and even beet sugar sweetened. Some of the things we assume today that people could get, they couldn't necessarily get. So just sugar wasn't necessarily what you could pick up day to day. In a section of the world where you had sugar beets, it was very common to get sugar beet sugar. I can't say I've cooked with it. Has anybody here cooked with sugar beet sugar? I mean, I've had food that they've used it as an additive. I just never seen it in all the stores I've gone in, from the healthy stores to the supermarkets. I've not really seen in the baking aisle next to the xanthan gum the beet sugar. So and so therefore I would imagine, if we're not seeing it on the marketplace today in all the artisanal amazing bakeries that there are in the world, it might not be the most desirable sugar to add into your bread. This is what we see a lot of. People would have added some dried fruits, because again, sugar, not only was sugar not always accessible, sugar would have been very expensive. However, you certainly had the opportunity to access raisins, prunes, other types of dried fruits that you would have found throughout Eastern Europe that you could add into that dough to help sweeten up the dough itself and give it a sweetness that might not have been there a little bit before. You might recall I mentioned raisin wine as a common wine in Eastern Europe. I can imagine creating some type of sweetened tea, almost like a simple syrup, that you would have your raisins in. So when you made your challah, it added a sweetness. Now, there's honey clearly available in Eastern Europe, but again, very expensive, seasonal. And when you bake with it, you got to be really careful because it can change the dynamic of the food very quickly. Until we get to the United States of America, we're talking probably simpler types of breads. We're probably talking home-based breads. The challah itself would have been consumed in its entirety. So Friday night, you would have had one for Shabbat dinner. Shabbat day for lunch, you would have had one. It would have been completely consumed. You wouldn't have had, in all likelihood, French toast on Sunday morning, although if you're lucky. Okay, so then I'm sure you've been dying to know, like, well, what about braids and eggs and sugar? Because, I mean, if you ask me, that seems to be pretty ubiquitous with when somebody says, I'm going to make challah, I'm going to eat challah, I'm going to the supermarket to get challah, I'm going to go out and get some challah for brunch or for challah French toast. So it really has to do with Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewry. And quite frankly, coming to the United States of America is a second impact. The braiding, as far as we can tell, braiding Braiding of challah, as far as we can tell, is probably adapted from the practices of the peoples with whom we shared our lands in Austria, Poland, anywhere, Russia, wherever it was in Eastern Europe that we were hanging out. And we saw that people were designing something very interesting, beautiful. It would have been influenced on us in the history of our existence. What I love talking about is, there's Jewish people have impact on culture and that we are entered into, and the culture that we're entered into has impact upon us. So, for example, the Seder, the 4 glasses of wine at the Seder, you probably have heard, it's very influenced by the idea of the Greek symposium. It's lovely. I'm not saying it's not ours. Of course, the Seder is ours, but where the influences come from and how we are shaped, it's beautiful to say that they're both going to be an influence of us upon the community around us and on the community around us upon us. So probably, as I said, adopted from local practices. And researcher Maggie Glaser actually sees it first in the 15th century in Austria and southern Germany, where she actually sees Jewish housewives following their non-Jewish counterparts, where they would see the baked goods coming out for their Sunday celebrations. Now, you can go to places like Budapest throughout Hungary and go into every bakery and see braided bread after braided bread after braided bread after braided bread. And, you could go and say to the shop owner, wow, that's beautiful challah. And they would probably say to you, I don't know what you're talking about. That's just the bread. Here, it's lovely. Would you like one? So the look is not specifically isn't necessary to it being kosher or it being useful or any of that nature. Now, eventually, because why not? Eventually, we're going to find symbolism tied into the braids. For example, saying it represents the 6 days of the week, create 6 braids. Saying it represents like the braids of a bride's hair, because the Sabbath is like the Sabbath queen, and Lachado D, one of our quintessential Friday night prayers, says, look, it's like we're at a wedding. And when beloveds come together at a wedding is what Shabbat should feel like. So these symbolisms kind of come into what we'll look at challah as that braided loaf. And the good news is there's more than just braided challah. In fact, you probably know about the round challah that we see from Rosh Hashanah through, in many places, the end of Sukkot, but certainly through the High Holy Day season. But really, there's been a practice of creating different styles of challah probably since around the same time. We just don't have an exact history. Designing challah in different shapes and sizes was very common in the Jewish communities of the Middle East, of Islamic lands throughout the Mediterranean basin. And so what we find is that challah originally was probably round. It could be leavened or flat style, like pita. Morocco was very common to have a round challah that was raised up almost like a crown. In some communities, it was very common to have either 2 or 4 loaves. Why 4 loaves? The 4 loaves would represent God's divine name, Yud, He, Vav, He. We don't say the name, we pronounce it Adonai. We don't say those words, but those 4 loaves would represent God's name. They might be small. I mean, when I say love, it could have been rollish style. And the other practice I loved finding was that in Syria, there was this practice among some people, they wouldn't eat any bread until Friday night, so they could really ready for it. I love that because for one reason or another, I find I don't eat bread on Fridays at all until I get to challah, and then I get to eat a lot of challah. How fun is that? So some other styles. In Tunisia, And I'll have some pictures to show you later. And you can find these recipes for sure online. There's one called bejma, which is 3 dough balls together, almost like the Olympic rings, right? And then we've got also, how do I do that? And then in the city of Jerba, they were baked in one common oven. And so every family would come up with some kind of spin in their circular challah, a braid, a twist, a plate, so that you could actually distinguish your own challah. Some communities, you would have a stamp. You could stamp a little side on your challah if you wanted to have your own family mark. And in Ethiopia, they have something that's called dabo, often sometimes called dabo, which is a sweetened bread that's got the nigella seeds kind of sprinkled on top. And this you can find in communities throughout the Ethiopian Jewish communities in Israel, but also now in the United States, places like New York, where you can see it approaching in some of the marketplaces. So now, I would get into the various styles. We know about the round style on the High Holy Days. The key style is also called shtisel, very common from about the 1500s on. The key to heaven, the key to a good life. The bird style challah that would be done at certain times of the year when the Torah portion mentioned a bird, let's say Shabbat Shirah. Of course, the menorah or the dreidel challah that would have been for Hanukkah. The ladder challah that would have been made, let's say, according to the Torah portion. Some of these would have been specific to the weekly Torah portion. So when Jacob has the dream of the ladder ascending between earth and heaven, we make a ladder challah, and of course a hand challah that many would use to represent blessings and wishes for a good year. Here's a couple of examples for you. You see up in the upper right corner the 3. You see on the left corner the key. You can see on the lower left area there the bird, a style of bird challah. That's done with a single piece that's kind of pulled through in a knot, and then they shape up the top area and they add a couple of raisins, clearly, or currants. And then another below on the right is a pomegranate style challah. Some people like to make the pomegranate challah for either Tu B'Shvat in the New Year of the Trees or even around the New Year holiday. You can see they're done in a pull apart style rather than the braided. Some people like the ball style, like the bird style in the bottom and the pomegranate style, because you can pull apart individual ones. And then you can see around here, the dabo is the one on the bottom. And then you can see all these different styles that people will create depending on the Torah portion primarily of the year. The dreidel on the lower left, menorah. The upper left is a crown style, Moroccan crown style, but you can see that for the High Holy Days as well. Not just for around year, but looking a bit like a crown on the head. The tree challah in the middle. The 10 Commandment challah, when you're reading the Torah portion with the 10 Commandments. The grapes, as you can see, symbolizing the land of Israel, and the Torah portion where we might read that. So that's really just the ways in which we've embraced this idea of bringing meaning and depth to our table, and becomes an experience with the eyes as well as with the mouth. There are so many ways that these chalot have been developed. You can even see that some of them, if you paint on it, let's say when you're baking it with water, it's going to look a little different than if you paint on top of it with egg wash, or if you do white egg, only the white or only the yellow. Some people like a honey wash on top. Depending on the places in the world, you might put poppy seeds, you might put sesame seeds, you might have no seeds. It really depended on the touch of the various moment. I went with, in this conversation for everyone today, the idea of having it be about the traditional challah, very much, not necessarily into the rainbow challahs and the alternative ways people are approaching today, because I wanted to get into what it is and how we have it. And then even further, like what other than braided challah is there? And you can go to a place like Ethiopia. You could go to Macau, the Jewish community, near India, and you can find that they're eating different foods and different types of chalot, because the bread that we associate with a various region or place or time is going to be for that very specific region. So a pita is just as legitimate as a braided, the 12 braided challah that we can see that goes out 3-4 feet at a wonderful wedding feast today. And all of these are challah, because the only part that's necessary for us, really, like the critical part for any of this, is that we take the dough, take a piece of that dough out, and you say lahfris challah, so that you're connecting both to our ancient practice of sacrifice, to the time of now, and to gratitude for the ability to create this food that can sustain us, especially if you're blessed to have the ability to digest the gluten, because not everyone does. So that's really the expanse of challah that I could bring today without actually having a cooking lesson involved with it as well. And that takes a long time, but I am happy to share. Kirk had asked earlier if I would share the recipe, and I'm happy to share that recipe. And I've got a couple of others that I can send to Marcia. Maybe she can distribute, that are from different communities. So the one that I'm making is in more the sweet end. But if you went to Morocco or Tunisia or Iraq or Syria, it's going to be very different tasting um, bread. Sometimes a little bit more of a plain, sometimes maybe with some different herbs and even those toppings. So, any questions as we get to this point in our morning? Has anyone here made their own? Oh yeah, James.
Yeah, just one or two things. You're talking about beet sugar.
Yeah.
Most sugar is beet sugar, believe it or not. They don't have to label it as beet. Most sugar in the world comes from beets.
So the store-bought sugar, you're saying, in the white, what we're going to call white sugar, is going to be a beet sugar.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And when you really think about, like in Europe, how did they get sugar cane, hundreds of years ago in those cold climates? It's through the beets. Yeah. And these beets are huge. They're like the size of pumpkins.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the first. Second, it's interesting that when they were talking about manna, that's really the first time Shabbat is ever mentioned. It's in relationship
as a practice,
food.
Right?
It's almost like a training wheel that what was to come.
Great.
Because it was never mentioned before that about the seventh day, and so it's interesting that Shabbat first was taught through the stomach, through food.
I love it.
That is really interesting, Jim.
I love it. Yeah. Thank you.
Do we actually hear? I mean, I don't. Do we? The story of the manna comes before a Seret HaDibrot.
Yeah.
Right before Shabbat. That is
right.
so. Oh my God, that's so interesting. All right.
So he did with the most basic element, food. That Shabbat was introduced.
That's an aha moment.
We could talk a lot about manna because there's so much written about what it was and how they used it, what maybe was, maybe it wasn't. Another time. Thank you, Jim. Were there anyone else had a question or?
I actually do. I mean, first of all, I mean, I know you address this, but for any bread to be kosher, as I understand it, challah must be taken.
Correct.
The fact that we call the substance that we use to honor our Shabbat table or our festival table challah is sort of like calling any tissue we use Kleenex. But but all kosher breads that we buy, challah was taken.
Correct.
And does challah have to be taken by any bread made from any grain? And is there any time that challah doesn't have to be taken? Like, does it actually not have to be taken if it's only being made in your house by you?
So
And
my understanding, and I can go deeper into halakha because it gets a little into the halakha, the Jewish law part, is that challah has to be taken for the bread to be kosher. So
okay,
kind of like, yeah, so you wouldn't find a bread with an OU with a certification on it that says it's kosher unless challah is taken.
and in the modern in our modern world, in a let's say in an industrial oven, do you happen to know what happens to that sacrificial piece
I
of
don't.
dough?
I don't. I haven't been into the factory. I'd be fascinated. It
I
seems
think
like
what
that would be a really technical.
I think what
Yeah.
they do is that they take it, they wrap it in foil, and they bake it with the challah. They bake it
Oh,
with
I mean, like we do. I mean,
yeah.
that's what we do. Yeah. I just didn't know. I'm curious if that's what they do in this huge, factory. No, it's great. Okay, we have to take a field trip now.
We can go to the Blessed Braid. Um, well, I just a couple of
Absolutely.
I have a few more minutes, so I just want to say, first of all, Micah, it was such a pleasure to have you be our teacher for the last 3 weeks. All the
Oh,
classes are
thank you.
recorded, and you can find them on our YouTube website. I will tell you that ALI is going on a little vacation for the next 2 weeks. The 23rd and the 30th, there will be no class on Mondays. Our next scholar in January, first scholar in January, is a fascinating person, Sarah Bracha Gershuni, Rabbi Sarah Bracha Gershuni. Do you know Micah? Do you know Sarah Bracha?
I don't think I do, but
Uh, So
that's okay. There's more to learn.
yes, and she like Micah has a deep spiritual side to her is sort of well known. She teaches a lot from My Jewish Learning and classes all over the world. She's, I think, British born, and she'll be doing her take. I know we've studied the Jewish calendar before, but her take is really interesting and different. So we'll have 4 classes with her through January. In February, I'm going to start featuring some of our local rabbinic talent who you have not learned from, uh, who will be teaching some of their passions in the rabbinate. So that's going to be fun. More to come on that, and then some other really exciting scholars like like Harley Lachter will be coming in March. So I'm really trying to create a very interesting year for all of you, and I love our intimate Monday morning learning session. I hope some of you who joined us because of Micah will stay with us. Ongoing. You'll continue to get our emails, and as I said before. It is the end of the year, and if you have not yet made a donation to the collaborative in support of this or other programs we run, we'd be most grateful if you could. Everything we do is open to everybody, and we are so happy to have you here. That's your presence is our biggest present, and yet we want to keep the lights on. So anyway, thank you for everything that you all do, and do you and we'll see you, our ALI people. Hopefully, I'll see some of you before then. See you in January. I want to wish you all a very happy Hanukkah and strength and blessings in 2025. Thanks so much.